Assessment Basics by Peggy Marcy, a professor at Cal State University, San Bernardino. This is the first video in this assessment series, and it will look at some aspects of assessment in the classroom, the basic aspects, all right? So first, let's compare feedback and assessment. In terms of the classroom, they're really the same. However, assessment is usually the term used for formal evaluation. But make no mistake about it, any kind of feedback is an assessment or evaluation of some kind. Feedback may be comments written on a paper or verbally delivered to students. They may or may not be graded. Feedback from peers and self can be just as valuable in learning as instructor feedback. I usually approach peer feedback or peer assessment as a way for students to recognize their own mistakes. It's easier to see mistakes in other people's writing than in my own writing. But as I examine theirs, I can find phrases that I like and want to use, as well as see mistakes that I want to avoid. Many students don't like or trust peer feedback on writing, and I have to say that my experience with ESL students didn't give me much confidence that they could accurately pick out mistakes. However, the students judged later in the semester that peer editing did improve their own writing. And I also have found that in oral speeches, peer feedback is much more successful than in writing. But again, if you approach it as peer editing or peer feedback in writing for the purposes of improving your own writing, then it's successful. Next, let's talk about formative and summative assessments. Summative assessments are the final evaluation, such as the unit test or the rubric for an oral presentation. It's unusual for those to be given again. Summative assessments are more likely to have a grade attached to them than formative assessments. Formative assessments are inserted into the process of the task or project or unit. They may or may not be graded, but usually are not graded. If they are graded, students are encouraged to repeat the task until they get 100%. An example of a formative assessment might be requiring learners to turn in the script or outline for their oral presentation so that you can offer feedback before the actual event. Or it could be asking learners to turn in a checklist of steps that they've completed before they give the actual product. The next aspect I want to discuss are formats for assessments. There are fixed format types, which are represented by true-false questions, multiple choice, multiple answer, fill in the blanks, and matching. Structured format usually requires a little more thinking on the part of the student because they need to manipulate the language in some manner. Perhaps they reorganize the words or they move them into various categories. If learners are asked to draw or sculpt their answers and there's only one correct way of drawing it or sculpting, then it would fit under structured format. If there are multiple options, then it would be considered an open-ended format. An example of one correct way to draw would pertain to directions. If the learner listens to the directions and then draws the route they heard on a map, then there's only one correct option. On the other hand, if they listen to a story and you ask them to draw 3 scenes from that story, it would be considered an open-ended format. Open-ended formats include written paragraphs or essays, short or long speeches, portfolios, and other performance-related activities. For example, perhaps we've been studying various idioms, and I want to know if the students have really learned how to use them appropriately. I might choose to create an assessment where I put them in pairs and ask them to create and record a dialogue that includes 3 of the idioms we learned. The last point for this video is about making the assessments fair. If you spend most of the lesson on role-playing dialogue in a restaurant, then it may not be fair to give them a written test with multiple choice questions about the vocabulary or any aspect of that. On the other hand, if you spent the whole time having them complete exercises in the workbook, it would likely be unfair to assess them with a role play at the end. In general, as much as possible, the assessment should look the same or be in the same category as the way they learned the material. In addition, you need to make sure that your assessment is designed in such a way that you're assessing what you want to. For example, If I ask them to draw scenes to assess their listening comprehension, I need to make sure that I don't count off for poorly drawn items. If they're able to communicate the gist through their drawing, then I should accept it. If I want to assess their listening by having them write a summary of what they heard, I need to be fairly generous on spelling and grammar mistakes, because that's not the purpose of the assessment. I should also understand that some students will have better short-term memory than others, so I would probably want to allow them to take notes while listening, which is a real-world skill, of course. If you've taught the material in ways that integrated various skills of listening, reading, writing, and speaking, then it's okay for the final assessment to include integration of skills. Just be careful about where you award or take away points. In summary, this video looked at the idea of feedback being a type of assessment, the difference between formative and summative assessment, item formats, and making the assessments fair.